So I'm Mandy. Thank you guys for coming to the session today. And we're going to talk about practicing science diplomacy at museums and science centers, what you've been hearing a lot already all day long. So when most people come to museums, whether it's the one that I'm at, along with Anna, at the American Museum in New York, or the National Museum here that Dave represents, or the museum in London, or Paris, or Tokyo, Cuba, or Iran, most people come full with excitement and eager to learn something interesting, right? So they're coming open and willing and exposed and engaged. All the ingredients that you need when you are trying to interact with someone on specific topics. And so what people might not realize is that a lot of what you see at the forefront on display is being driven by scientists, real time, who are doing real research to amass the collections that's always put out front. And for every item out front, there's always like 10 million more in the back. And so what we're going to do today on this panel is speak a little bit about what the scientists are doing on a day-to-day basis to engage, what administrators that work at science centers and museums are doing, and what we think is an activity that we've been engaging in for a while, but is now can be actively labeled as science diplomacy. And so to be amassing that field work, amassing those collections, you have to go out and do field work, which is, of course, meaning an international expedition around the world. And in this sense is where, when I say that museums are engaged in science diplomacy, museums really are a cultural venue for diplomacy. It's where we're sort of waging this hearts and minds campaign on issues ranging from climate change to evolution to conservation of animals and conservation of our planet. And so when people come to museums, they're ready and they're open and they're eager. And depending on what museums are showing them, we really are starting to map out places for the thought. So there's a lot of thought leadership engagement, and also places for the truth as science sees it, right? So the truth on evolution, the truth on climate change, and things of this nature. So the museums actually are a venue in which the lay public's engaging in science diplomacy, even though they might not be aware of it, and the museums themselves might not be aware of it sometimes. So I'm a scientist working on venomous marine snails. I call them killer snails. And as a part of my group's training and what we need to do, we travel the world. And in traveling the world to collect these organisms, they're tropical marine organisms found all over the world. And part of what we have to do is arrange for permits and visas, and we have to interact with our local counterparts to find the best locales for collecting the snails. And so there's a lot of cultural as well as administrative and policy things that are going on when you plan a fieldwork expedition. And so while at the surface, the major issue is always making sure you get your permits and you get visas for everyone to travel. And being a lab head, all the members of my group are from Spain. I have someone from Iran. I have someone from India. So it's not just getting an American visa to travel to Papua New Guinea. It's trying to get that Spanish student a visa, trying to get my Iranian student a visa, and it becomes a real issue of who can go to field work and who cannot. But that's just a narrow thing that's engaged when you're working at museums. And museums, I think, have gone through this evolution in which we started with doing, the colonial idea of what museums were, and there's a lot of cultural appropriation, to really working on global missions. Again, conservation of the animal, conservation of our planet, and also now I think embracing the idea that museums and science centers are key venues for education, primarily pre-K and early education venues. And I think this is all being nicely summarized when we think about the Sustainable Development Goal. All of these goals at their heart have something to do with science, one way or the other, and all of them also have issues that are reflected when you walk into museums. Whether it's climate action, number 13, or life below the water, number 14, life on land, number 15, even quality education. As I mentioned, you'll hear a little bit more about the STEM programs that are going on, and affordable and clean energy. All of these are things that museums and science centers treat as topics on a daily basis, in which they try to have public programs to engage students, senior students, which we call lifelong learners at our museums, and also where the scientists working behind the scenes are forming opinions and putting out papers and engaging with their counterparts around the world to set up and interact. And so when we talk about the dimensions of science diplomacy and how it pertains to museum scientists are involved in advising science in diplomacy. So they advise not only their administrators, but they also advise with their counterparts and also try to set what I guess you would call policy statements for climate primarily and conservation of animals. We're also involved in enabling. So in order for this to happen, all this field work to happen, there have to be agreements, kind of like the Nagoya Agreement, which we'll talk a little bit about in a little bit more. And then there's this, what I call confidence building, sometimes referred to as science for diplomacy. So the interaction, in order for any of this to occur, there must be relationships and bonds between the scientists themselves in order for the larger frame of action to go forward. And so today, with the panel, we're going to start with David Chindel. And Dave's going to talk to us a little bit about what he's done in conservation surrounding DNA barcoding. Then we're going to go with Anna. Anna is from the American Museum. And Anna's going to talk broadly about international relations at museums, particularly with nations of conflict, a new exhibit, the Cuba exhibit that recently opened, and for which we have some media pieces in the lobby if you haven't seen them. And then we're going to finish with Walter. Walter is from the Association for Science and Technology Center. And Walter's going to talk broadly about STEM initiatives and the Sustainable Development Goals as what's going on. So this is our panel. So thank you again for coming. And we're going to start off with Dave. So we'll go 10 minutes with each. We'll take one question after each person as we switch slides. And then at the end, we'll have about 30 minutes of discussion if all goes well and no one talks too long. So first up is Dave.
Thanks, Mandy. Yeah, I'll drive once you flip it over. I want to talk from here. If everybody, I'm tall enough, I'll sit tall in the saddle. I want to be talking about the natural history side of the panel, biodiversity in general. And I won't be talking about anything so lofty as sustainable development goals or the importance of biodiversity or ecosystem services. My goal here is to give you a ground level view of what the issues are, the diplomatic issues in international research and related fields. It's not just research that I'll be talking about. So let me begin with some very politically incorrect statements. This is a kind of, in spirit, the kind of conversation you can expect when OECD country representatives and developing country representatives get together. What maybe not what they're saying, but what they're thinking. So somebody from the north might say, do you want to buy our commodities? We've got a lot of wheat on sale here. We've got a lot of soybeans in particular. The south would say, well, we're not sure we trust your exports. We don't know if they're genetically modified. We don't know how much antibacterial injections they've had. We're not even sure they're properly labeled. We don't trust you. The north might say, well, we really value your biodiversity, by which they might mean we value the compounds that might get turned into cosmetics or pharmaceuticals. We love how those trophy heads look mounted on our walls. We'd love to have a polar bear skin in our family room. And the south might say, stop poaching our rare and endangered species. You know, they're ours. They're not your playthings. The north might say, we want to develop your biocompounds. They're valuable. And the south might respond saying, great, why don't you help us with training and capacity building so that we can manage and develop our own natural resources, and then we can do business together once the playing field has been leveled a little. The north might say, people like me or Mandy in our northern museums, we need to borrow some samples from some of your species, and it's purely for academic research. And the south might respond, you still owe us money for what you took. That is, you may, if a well-paid scientist in the north wants something we own, there's got to be money in it somewhere. Why aren't we getting some of that reward? That's what they could say if there was no politeness in the conversation. So I'm going to talk about species of high value, which means this goes all over the sector, across sectoral boundaries. Commodities, drugs, rare and endangered species, microbes of medical value. So it involves commerce, law enforcement, intellectual property. It's not just researchers in a museum. And since the end of the great empires, well, let me back up. During the period of the great empires, the Southern Hemisphere basically was our supermarket. We could go and take anything we wanted. It was a warehouse, and anything alive or dead, we just took it. You know, the King of Belgium owned the entire Congo as personal property, and he brought a whole village back with him and set it up in the backyard of the what's now the Royal Museum of Central Africa. And of course, they all died from northern diseases, and they're buried behind the museum. But it was the king's or the queen's or the president's pleasure that were served by the natural world. In the post-colonial world, the United Nations became a site where conventions were set up, and there's about a dozen conventions dealing directly with biodiversity, and then a whole scad more, things like the World Intellectual Property Organization, World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization. But these are just some of the conventions, some of the international treaties dealing with biodiversity. I'm not going to go into great detail. International Plant Protection Convention was one of the first ones, entered into force in 1952. Related to that, the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, that followed in 2004. I'm going to focus on the next two. The Convention on Biological Diversity entered into force on the last days of December 1993, and the Nagoya Protocol, which is a protocol of the CBD Convention, that entered into force in 2014. Cartagena Biosafety Protocol, that's mostly about genetically modified organisms. That's also a protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity. I'm not going to talk about Cartagena. International Plant Protection Convention, IPPC, is basically how do you control the passage of pests, agricultural pests, between countries. So it's all about inspection and quarantines. If I'm the United States and I'm shipping wheat, and the receiving country says, there's a blight on this wheat, we're not going to let it in. We're either going to fumigate it or destroy it or send it back. And the United States says, no, you're mistaken. That's not a wheat rust. That's something benign. Now there's a disagreement about what's on the wheat, if anything, that could explode into a trade war. It's certainly worth a lot of money for what's on the ship. But what's at greater risk is if they let the wheat in and it is a blight, it could destroy a wheat crop and other crops in the receiving country, or it could set off a trade war between two countries or even two continents, since things like agricultural pests don't respect international boundaries. So there's a lot at risk there, so they set up an international convention saying, how do you identify this blight? Well, let's agree on the criteria so that if one side says this has blight on it, the other side will agree. That's what it's for. Related to that, both of these two, by the way, are under the Food and Agriculture Organization, which is delightfully headquartered in Rome. We call this the Plant Treaty, the International Treaty for Plant Genetic Resources, and this is a fabulous agreement among a lot of countries, most of the world, that says we will create a free trade zone for about 60 species of crop plants, so that breeding centers, and there's hundreds of breeding centers, about a couple of dozen main ones, seed banks belonging to governments, local farmers, that have plant varieties with different characteristics that can now easily be traded. You don't have to go through a big permitting process as long as they're checked for, by the IPPC criteria, they're checked for diseases that could be transmitted. As long as they're clean, you can move these plants around. Why? Because it's a global public good for plant breeders to be able to develop new strains of food. So here on the right is an Indian farmer who is trying to develop what kind of crop? Eggplants. eggplants that can be irrigated with wastewater. Plants that can tolerate high salinity water, or can resist droughts, or can resist pests, all of global value. So for these 66, I think, species, it's easy to move things around the world. You don't need a special permit. And if anybody develops a new cultivar, a new plant strain that makes a lot of money, then money goes back into the pot to support the system. So, interesting convention, right? CITES, the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. It's got a list of about 35,000 species that are either fully protected against poaching and international trafficking, or are regulated so that you need special permits. So, global public good to keep these species alive. So, up in the upper right-hand corner is sandalwood. It's prized for perfume, and ivory tusks from elephants. This is rosewood. I think it's rosewood. The trouble is, it's pretty easy to identify that comes from an elephant, although it could come from a mastodon or a woolly mammoth. If they're fossils, they're not protected by CITES. But assuming they're elephant, that's a no-no. You're not supposed to have those. But those are blocks of lumber, and those are just sticks of dried wood. What species did they really come from? The illegal trafficking in endangered species is among the top 4 transnational crimes in the world. Estimates range from 20 to 60 to 80 billion dollars a year in trade. A tremendous amount of that is high-value timber species, exotic hardwoods. I'm going to talk about CBD, Convention for Biological Diversity, and I've put up 2 of the most difficult parts of this. On the left is the symbol for an NGO called ETC. I forget what it stands for. These are the people that bring you the Captain Hook Award. Every time the Convention on Biological Diversity meets, every 2 years, they award a list of people or organizations the Captain Hook Award for acts of biopiracy, that something has been stolen, allegedly stolen from a developing country, and there was no remuneration for the money that was made from it. On the right, a traditional farmer or traditional medicine person raising exotic plants that are secret to many societies, just want to keep it secret. They don't want to let any information out. Pharmaceutical companies, of course, want to know what's in those plants. So access to that information, access to those samples, is really valuable and hotly contested. CBD was mostly about getting return back from northern development of biodiversity taken from the southern world. The incidental bycatch of that was biological research. So now it is as hard for Pfizer to get plants out of a country as it is for a botanist at the American Museum to get it out. It's a long process, depending on the country, of getting permits, permission. Let me talk about that for a minute while the slide goes out. This is to spare you a couple of PowerPoint slides. Convention on Biological Diversity has 3 goals: preserve biodiversity, manage its sustainable use. That is, biodiversity has to be used, right, for food, for clothing, for fuel, lots of things, but we have to do it in a sustainable way. So that's the second goal. And the third is to fair and equitably share the benefits that derive from access to genetic resources. Now, underline, this is about genetic resources. This is about being able to reproduce the plants or animals, not only the bearskin rug, but if you take could you clone polar bears, for example? If you clone polar bears, then wherever you got that original polar bear cell, you should pay something back to the country from which you got it. That led to the Nagoya Protocol, which laid out a framework for countries to start passing laws and creating regulations that would restrict or regulate how you give access to the people who want to get your samples and move them offshore. So I want to talk about one example, and this gets to the project that we ran with a grant from Google for 4 years, and it's to judge this problem, to answer the question, did this thing come from an endangered species? So this relates to the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species. Most of the time you can identify something. A lot of the time now you can't, and that's because poachers and traffickers are getting very clever about disguising what species they have and what they're trading. So you see that parrot in the upper left, easy to identify, but now poachers and traffickers will take that bird, pluck its feathers off, put it in a plastic tube alive, ship it, and if it's confiscated en route, they can't identify it. They'd have to hold the suspect for several weeks or months while the feathers grew back so they could identify it. But using the DNA method we call DNA barcoding, it's a consortium that I've run for the last 12 years, to develop a public database of DNA sequences that are diagnostic so that with about a 4-hour test, you can take that naked parrot, take a little bit of its toenail, get its DNA, sequence it, and you know what it's from. Here's how it works. Start with identified museum specimens or specimens from zoos or the wild, get a little bit of their DNA, extract it, amplify it, sequence the particular part of the genome that you're interested in. This is called the standard DNA barcode region, and then publish it to GenBank. And we've been building a public reference library of endangered species for years. Then when there's an unknown, like a powder, you do the same thing, extract the DNA, sequence it, compare it to the library, and you get an identification by what it clusters with. So the Barcode of Wildlife project was funded by Google. We worked with 6 countries. 3 of them succeeded magnificently. Here's what we did that was different. Unlike a typical research project, we didn't take any tissues out of the country. We trained people in the country to do all the sequencing, to collect the data, collect the specimens, process them, archive them, publish the data to GenBank. We helped teach the law enforcement people how to handle crime scene evidence to preserve the DNA, how to use the DNA barcoding technique to identify it, and to take it into court. So what's happened? Research institutions in Mexico, Kenya, and South Africa are now independent. They can do this all on their own. The enforcement agencies in those countries either have or are building their first ever wildlife forensic labs to be able to do DNA sequencing in country. Several hundred cases have been brought to court, and convictions have already been obtained for poachers in Kenya and South Africa. USAID has in fact given support for a number of projects in Kenya to continue this work. What's different about the philosophy of this project is we transferred capabilities and skills into the country to help them be able to manage, study, and use their DNA, their animal species and plant species, without relying on a big brother in the north. At the same time, we've established very strong trust relations with those countries that will open a lot of doors to allow collaborative research going back and forth. That is one of the goals of CBD, is to level the technological playing field. So science, the message to science diplomacy in this field is we're going to have to recognize the necessity to build the capabilities of our partners if we want to have those partners collaborate with us. Thanks.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you, Dave. Perfect timing. We have time for one question as we switch to the next speaker. Anna, questions? Yes?
I got to remember my question. I'm Christina I represent Eversole Associates, but I was a biologist for 10 years for USDA, and I actually worked with plant viruses and that kind of thing. And I was just curious, and I heard about the Barcode initiative, and I was just curious if you have any papers so I know what genes you actually look at and how you do the diagnostics.
Yeah, it's a very common mitochondrial gene. For animals, it's cytochrome C oxidase 1. And for plants, there's 2 genes, MACK and RBCL.
RBCL.
Not as effective. It's about 75% effective in plants. It's over 95% effective in animals. It's
Oh,
unbelievable
okay.
how well it works in
Yeah.
animals. It's like I still can't really believe it's real.
Thank you.
Hello. Oh, these are loud. Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Porzokanski, Director of the Center for Biodiversity and Conservation at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And what I wanted to do is actually provide a case study of how we have led science collaboration and science diplomacy around this exhibition and the scientific research that we've been doing in collaboration with Cuban partners. I'm going to go quite quickly. I have a lot of pictures that I want to share with you. So if you have any questions about them, we can chat about them later. I'm going to start my timer. Thank you. Just I like to see where I am. So these are the key questions I want to address. Why did we do a Cuba exhibition? Why Cuba? How did we frame the exhibition? What made it possible, and what we have learned from the experience? So why Cuba? Well, we felt that most people have a certain kind of association with Cuba, which is, politics. They think Cuba, they think Castro, they think everything that's happened between the United States and Cuba, or they think about perhaps old cars and big cigars and beautiful architecture, music, dancing on the streets. We have like a, yes, sorry, there you go. Can you hear me there? Yes. Sorry about that. It's hard to know from here. Okay. So people tend to have like a postcard view of Cuba, and we wanted to show a different view of Cuba, more focused on the ecosystems and biodiversity that make it so unique that many people are not that familiar with. And so we wanted to emphasize that in the exhibition. Cuba has remarkable ecosystems, landscapes on land, on the coasts, really amazing diversity also underwater and underground, because Cuba has a lot of caves, some of the highest densities found in the world. And so we thought this was an opportunity, because of our expertise, to kind of show you the colors of Cuba in a different way. This is the national bird, which also has the colors of the flag. And so in a way, almost reveal these kinds of hidden colors of Cuba. And that is the logo of the exhibition, the artwork, actually, that Cuban artist Michelle Millares Olans did for the exhibition, which shows this throat fan of an anolis lizard. So we thought there was more to know about Cuba. And we decided to do it now because, of course, all eyes are on Cuba. All eyes were on Cuba, especially when we started with everything that was going on. And it was a good moment for people to learn, go beyond the headlines and learn more about, Cuban nature and Cuban culture. So how did we frame the exhibition? We decided to frame it with some key questions in mind. We wanted folks who came to the exhibition to leave with a better understanding of who are the Cuban people, how is Cuba's biodiversity unique and why, how is Cuba connected, and how is Cuba changing? And you'll notice that we're not saying how has it been or how has it been changing, because we wanted to focus on Cuba today. This was really a big focus. Other things that were very important for us was that it would be a collaborative process with Cuban partners, that it would be a bilingual exhibition. It was the first one that we did that's fully bilingual, and that it would feature Cuban voices prominently. So these were kind of like our guiding ideas for how we framed the exhibition, which we developed together with colleagues at the National Museum of Natural History of Cuba in Havana. And so this was the gallery, just to give you an idea. We had a blank slate to start with. And I don't know where the pointer. Yeah, this, to give you an idea of scale, is what the size of a car would be. And so after many, many months and many designs and scrapping many ideas, we came up with, of course, an introduction section, and then stories about nature, stories about culture, and a boulevard or a recreation of an urban scene to speak about some of the more recent changes in society and economy, and also the vibrancy of urban life and street life in Cuba. And so this provides the framework that we then used. The process was, the amazing team of the American Museum of Natural History of over 40 people that work in exhibitions. They do a model. This is a maquette, that's quite detailed. And this is, for example, a recreation of a coral reef. And this then we fabricate it in-house. And so it was really amazing to see the artists put this together, obviously always consulting with our Cuban colleagues about the specifics. Then we had to write the show. There was a lot involved in that. A lot of collaboration, a lot of consensus building of what the narrative should be with our colleagues. And we touched on many topics, from nature to, for example, Afro-Cuban religion, how the cars have changed in Cuba and why, what's behind the story. And this is what it looks like, and I hope you'll come visit in New York. This is the introduction with voices of Cuba. We sent a photojournalist to Cuba to look at this. And we have an introduction with the basic geography of Cuba to highlight how large it is, where it is, how close to us it is, where is Guantanamo Naval Base, where's Guantanamo City, how many Cubans live in Florida, et cetera. So some basic information. For example, many people don't know that Cuba has more than 4,000 islands. It's actually an archipelago, and how large it is, et cetera. So these were some key data we wanted folks to know. Then we decided to provide an introduction or a context for contemporary realities through a movie, a new film that we produced as well in-house, 10-minute film that tackles, tries to cover in a balanced way all of Cuban history in 10 minutes. And we succeeded, I think, largely. So we go all the way from even before conquest to the indigenous peoples that started, really arriving into Cuba 6,000 years ago, all the way through its many stages, independence, Batista, the revolution, the special period, the warming up of the relationships to who knows what the future will bring. So we did this in a way that we felt in a lot of consultation with colleagues in Cuba. Then as you round the bend, we did put a car in the exhibition, which was a subject of a lot of debate. Some people felt it was cliche, me among them. But then, we decided, well, let's use it as an entry point to get people to learn about why these cars are in Cuba. What is the history behind this? And so that gives us that footing. The Boulevard, where we provide some more information on how Cuba is changing, Cuban traditions. And in the kind of nature stories, we feature 4 ecosystems. Cave ecosystems that tell us about Cuba's past, including some of the incredible biota that has gone extinct, the incredible Cuba's forests and the incredible biodiversity you find there, from the tiny ones to the big ones to the fantastic ones, and really just amazing creatures that are found nowhere else. So those snails, this bat, they're found in Cuba and nowhere else. In fact, 95% of the frogs, for example, are found nowhere else in Cuba. So really an incredible biota. Incredible mammals as well, like the venomous solenodon, thought extinct in the 70s, and my favorites, some of the birds, which are really remarkable, including the smallest bird in the world. So all of this is featured in the exhibition. And we wanted also to feature some live animals in the exhibition. We also feature a reproduction of a coral reef and the wetlands of Zapata Peninsula. And here we emphasize biological connections. So for example, osprey migrate through Cuba, and some stay in Cuba every year. Many other birds do as well. Coral reef larvae, when they spawn, connect Cuban waters and the rest of the Caribbean. So, and Cuba also shares environmental threats. So there's a lot of connections with us. And so we wanted to highlight that. We also highlighted Cuban scientists like Dr. Gilberto Silva Taboada, who came on an expedition with us in 2015, in every room. And for the cultural side, we feature tobacco, cultivation, Afro-Cuban religion, and Cuban art. And I can tell you more about it. And we end again with the voices of Cuba. So that's how we framed the exhibition. What made it possible was the institutional affinity that we had with our partners, really close, long history of collaboration, but also really aligned interests and modes of working. This history of collaboration is very long. It starts actually, It starts before the 1900s with expeditions that span all of the 20th century to the present, to last year or year and a half. And so they used to look like this, now they look like this. But it has been a long and steady history of collaboration. And this is the last expedition in 2015. And it produced very valuable data for Cuba and for us. For example, these are the species that were known before the expedition in 3 sites in Humboldt National Park in Cuba, eastern Cuba. And these are the species that were documented by the international team in just a couple of weeks. We also did capacity development. They certainly developed our capacity in the field because they are the experts. And we also had many courses in Havana. And we developed a lot of education materials to go along with it for the many thousands of school children that have gone through the exhibit. In fact, the exhibition, as of this weekend, has received more than 150,000 people. Oh my God, I was too ambitious. Oh, 2 minutes. Oh, good. I was like, what happened? Okay. Is that me? Thank you. So those are some of the things that I think made it possible, that we invested heavily in capacity building, in capacity development, mutual really, are continuing to do so, that we had shared goals. And what have we learned? So I think that we had some conditions for success that are well known, such as these that were highlighted by some of the National Research Council, for example, recently. We had a focus on areas that have been identified as priorities for both partners. We engaged researchers who have cultural awareness and local language skills, such as me, for example, because I'm originally from Uruguay, South America, and I do think that played an important role. We included capacity building. We have an explicit data sharing component, and we are building on these well-established collaborative activities. We also benefited from the trust, transparency, and respect that was already between these partners, and that is also additionally built by being in the field together, and what I would call a real enabling environment. So as you can probably imagine, we were riding a really good wave, right? So there were all these internal drivers, things that the museum was pursuing, that really aligned very well with what was happening outside. So these are the things that the museum was doing over time. And then, of course, these incredible other developments, such as the announcement of the restoring of relationships, et cetera, were happening. And all of these environmental agreements were happening as we were planning this exhibition, which really facilitated us being able to sign a comprehensive MOU last year. So I wanted to just end with one reflection, which is that I see all of this not so much as all of these factors kind of pushing a boulder up the road, and then if some of them fall apart by gravity, it will just all unravel. I see it more as kind of building of terraces. And so every action facilitates these new playing fields, these new areas where we have room to move. And, you know, a stone from that terrace may come loose, but I do think that we build these more stable, new kind of playing fields that can serve for all of those kinds of science, diplomacy, interactions that Mandy was talking about. So I hope this is a useful case study, and we're happy to answer more questions. Thank you very much. Yes. Sorry about the volume at the beginning.
Casimiro Vizzini from UNESCO headquarters in Paris. I was wondering if you approached in the exhibition, or if it was controversial to approach the health system of Cuba, because scientifically it's extremely important, especially the help that they're giving to other Latin American countries. I don't know if in the US it's probably not appropriate, but...
To be honest, we had, for example, the head of the Environmental Agency of Cuba come through the exhibit, and that was her only criticism, that they wish we had included more on kind of science and technology beyond biodiversity science. The truth is, there were a couple of reasons for that. One was that it was hard to find really good data. It was complicated. There was a lot of debate about some of the data we had access to. And we didn't have room for everything. So unfortunately, that was one of the things that I feel we didn't do justice to. We also didn't do justice to music for that purpose, for that matter. We did do a number of public programs that aim to go into more depth in those areas. But I do think if I could do it over again, that's the one thing I would change. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's always hard to come after a presentation of a natural history museum with this kind of really, it's not fair. And on the other hand, also when our last speaker gives you the chance to react a little bit to what some of them have said. And so over the weekend I had to spit in a tube because my daughter, who is the daughter of a Belgian citizen and an African-American woman, wanted to know who she was, and so she wants us to spit in a tube and send it to National Geographic and find out who she is. And so the good reason now I found out that the reasons for me is I must make sure that I'm not a descendant from the King of Belgium, because otherwise, So thanks for inviting me, and I'm going to speak in particular about science centers and how I organize international programs and how that may fit or may not in science and diplomacy. If you had the chance sometime to speak with a leader or someone of the leadership of Science Museum, there are two things that he or she would tell you. And the first thing that they would say is, we are not only a playground for kids. And the second thing that they would say to you is, we are a safe place for difficult conversations. So I'm going to tell you why I disagree with both of these things. So, of course, we do more than just address kids. But what's wrong with addressing special kids? And kids today, and as let me mention a French professor, Tadei, who just made a report for the French government about the future of education, says kids are born researchers. They have the curiosity, they have the way and the practice that comes the closest to what researchers do in their daily life. When something goes wrong, they try something different, and they make a hypothesis what they should do and test it, and they go back and forth and they do that. They lose that capacity when they go to school, because school actually kills that. And so why Science Center should really focus on kids is to make sure that we maintain that idea of how research will work and how the scientific process goes, because it's with them from the beginning. So that's a good thing. But why should it be safe? And so this is an analogy with all this movement that here in the US try to fight this traditional playground that you have in 50 corners of every city that are all the same color and also predictable, and when kids can do everything and they never get hurt and they don't take any risk of any kind, and so they don't learn anything. And so the point is, why should it be safe? Why can we not create an environment where people actually have to put themselves at risk? And so the point that I want to make is, whether it is with kids or adults, what we want is this. And whether it is an art museum or a science museum, we want that people get inspired, but also that they change attitudes and behaviors so that what they learn, they can put it into practice and change something in their community or in their country or in the world, not just learning for learning, right? So that's my point. Why it's good to work with kids, and it should not be safe, not for them and not for the adult visitors. What do I do? Well, I modestly try to create dialogues worldwide between young people. And why do I do that? Because with kids, and you probably work with kids as well, but not only kids, but young adults as well, teenagers, they all want to do something to make the world a better place. This is a real thing. Kids that come to museums or that you see in schools when they do projects, they want to make the world a better place. And they want to do that by working with kids in other places of the world. They want to go and look beyond their own city, their own community. They're really excited about that. And finally, they want to use the new technologies to do that. So these are the three elements that I think very characterize what young people want to do these days. And so one of the things is an example, and don't have to read this, but this is a scenarios program what science centers could do in support of the Rio Summit in 2012. we organized events and we paired kids in science museums all over the world around a topic that was related to the negotiations in Rio. And for example, this is a combination between Maloca in Colombia and a museum in Florida, where the kids locally explored what the problem was with their problem with water in their community. And they would first explore that for themselves, try to find solutions or how to make it a better access to water for different people in their community. And then they would dialogue and explain to each other what they found, and then try to figure out why the solutions that they may propose in different places were different, although the problem was the same. This is one, for example, how climate change affected health in different parts of the world, and that's a partnership between Mozambique and Rio de Janeiro. These are the kids from Rio. And we did then a big event in Rio where all the teams that we partnered all over the world actually had a video conference together and explained the results of their yeah, that's a very interesting image. We partnered as well with the COP21 meeting in Paris. We were at Cité des Sciences, Univers Sciences called now, with 7 countries represented. We had taken the example of the museum in the Adirondacks here, who organizes every year science summits and youth summits about climate change in their community. What kids from schools come to the science center, meet with experts, with scientists, with local businesses, etc. And after 3 days, they have to come up with a local solution for a local problem that is related to their energy use. And then when the problem is described and the solution is proposed, they have to go back to school and make sure that it is applied somehow, either in the school or in the community. We have disseminated that example to the world, and we had 7 countries represented at the event in Univers Sciences, Finland and South Africa and all of that. And so it's, this is one example of the one in the Wild Center. A problem, an example, World Biotic Tour kids are promoting or making festivals about biotech sciences all over the world, but the core of, these are the different places, the core is an ambassadors program where kids choose for a topic that relates to biotech, and then they connect with researchers, and then they try to go and communicate about that in their communities. So what we find with that program is that the kids, as I said earlier, they try to find a topic of biotechnology that can help them or that can help the planet. They really try to find out, how can I clean the oceans? How can I make sure that there is enough food in Africa for people, to grow for people to live there and all of that. So that's the topics that they come up with. They find researchers that work on that, they go in their labs, they work with them, and then the Science Center trains them to communicate about it and send them out to schools and to markets and to all places like that. And it's very interesting to see how the population who never goes to a museum that you meet on the market listens much more to a 15, 16-year-old that says, I was passionate about that. I learned about it. A year ago, I didn't know anything, but now I'm telling you, that's what I learned. People are really excited by the kids doing that. And so then we bring them together, and we exchange between the different countries in the world. And this was, for example, an exchange where they had all to prepare a topic that related to a controversy that might appear in the topic that they were researching, because there is no, we don't want that they think that there is no controversy or that it's just like straightforward, everything is good. So and this is a latest initiative which is called, we organized the first time the International Science Center and Science Museum Day on the 10th of November last year. It was a partnership with UNESCO and at the occasion of the UNESCO Science Day for Peace and Development, and it was addressing the role of science centers and science museums. We took Sustainable Development Goals as the core of that activity. And we had actually two fields to convince. First, our own field. And as you mentioned earlier, we all do exhibitions and programs that relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. We just don't know it. And my biggest task was, in the first months of that program, is to convince museums and say, when we speak to you about UNESCO and UN Sustainable Development Goals, don't open big eyes or do like you don't know. look into your museum, look into the exhibitions that you have, and tell me, and come back to me, and there tell me that you do not address them in one of your programs. And of course, it was the opposite. Everyone actually discovered that they had something to do with it. And so we have collected all the stories from museums all over the world who were actually showing that they were doing sustainable development goal activities. And then, of course, we have to convince UNESCO and other organizations that, listen, we have 300 million people visiting our science centers every year. It's not just like visitors, like that go in an art museum to have an experience, and nothing wrong with art museums, but people who come to a science center and a science museum, they come because they want to learn something, and they want to learn something to use in their community. If you set up a program and you want to educate the public about sustainable development goals, the science behind, the potential that it has, partner with us. We have an impact with 300 million people and the communities around these people that you can never match if you do that. And so that's the big intention of that. So how do we make then these kids become actually aligned with decision making? And what I'm advocating in my field is that the scientific community go much further than us in the science field in trying to have science being the base of every decision making. And we in science centers, we are not there yet. And what I think is we need for that is having kids being trained to become these people who look at decision making based on science. And for that, we need to give them the skills that not the school not necessarily give them. And these are the skills that you can, of course, see. So that means that then, you know, if you have these skills and you participate in the discussion, you maybe say yes or no to some question instead of just giving people an option to choose. The point is that I want to make after now, at the end of this, is that for me, it's not only about science. And you can read this, but I think we have had a lot of discussion about the post-truth society. And this philosopher, Kathleen Higgins from Austin, describes it very well. And she said, scientists must keep reminding society of the importance of the social mission of science to provide the best information possible as the basis for public policy. And they should publicly affirm the intellectual virtues that so efficiently model critical thinking, sustained inquiry, etc., etc. That's exactly what I said earlier. That is the skills that we want to give the kids to be able to make the right decisions once they know what the problem is. And I think that today they can only do that if they also associate with that the ethics of the decision that they want to make. I think very strongly that the future of science centers and science museums is going to be only successful if they associate themselves with humanities, and that we speak about philosophy in science centers as well, because decisions only about based on science would not be enough. And I want to end with two things here. This is a picture of the portal created at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, D.C. The possibility for people and visitors to connect with refugees in camps in Iraq and in Syria. And I organize visits with the staff of our organization to have this possibility to understand and to create the dialogue with these people and to understand. And so the thing that came out of that is that we all have very wrong ideas who refugees are. And of course there are worse camps, and I know South Sudan is not Syria and all of that, and I know that. But it was very important for us to learn that the people we're talking about, the first question that we asked to a young person was, and what is your ambition? And he said, I'm passionate about biology, I want to be professor. And say, yeah, really? We didn't expect that. But so there is a lot with these refugees that means that they have a lot of capacity and a lot of potential that we need to make sure that we dialogue with them about it. And so finally, this is something that I'm doing, which are interviews on air with people. This is the director of the Science Center in Thessaloniki, and he has a special program for refugees in this country. Greece is really on the border of many of these routes of, and he tells very lively in this interview that he said, for us it's really an asset These people are doctors, they are professors, they are teachers. When we work with them, it's for the good of our community, and we want them to be here with us and trained, and so that's why we open our doors for them. And so that's a very specific role for Science Center in this thing. So the reflection that I have, speaking with these refugees and with this person, is that they are refugees because some type of autocratic regimes destroy the country and they destroy cultural heritage. So if the question is true that actually anti-democratic organizations destroy cultural heritage and scientific heritage, should our role in science centers and museums not be more aggressive in teaching democracy? Thank you.
Thank you. So a question for Walter before we transition to the panel.
I'm happy. I mean, I'm always Casimiro Vizzini from UNESCO. I'm happy you mentioned the day for peace and the World Science Day for Peace and Development that we organize in UNESCO. I was actually present organizing, presenting the project Perform. I'm responsible of this project. It's a EU-funded project, and it's about the use of performing arts through scientific museums and scientific centers for high school students in vocational education. So, I mean, to improve engagement in scientific careers. We are trying, the UNESCO role is trying to involve more institutions like museums and centers in the education of even the scholar education. So in the introducing in the curricula this way of teaching science that is quite far away from the current way of teaching science, that is a way that sometimes push kids away from science more than motivating them. So I think I would like to know if you think that is an approach that you will support, will keep supporting with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no doubt about it. I think I agree with you that I said it. Most of the time, the way that traditional schools teach science is not inspiring at all, and so modestly think that in science centers we can do things that are a little bit different. As I say, one of the important things is doing things in a group, discussing what the right questions are that you have to pose, decide together what is the best question, try to then formulate what the potential answer is, test, and all of these things that you don't have time maybe in school to do. And so the science centers, they do all that. So and also they open much more these days to other disciplines, and I really focused on that as well. So the connection between the science and the arts is certainly one that's very important. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So now I'm going to do a few questions to the panel, and then we'll open it up. And in between those questions, if you have something, just raise your hand that you want to add or contribute. So the first question kind of builds on what Walter was talking about. The kids are saying we want to save the world. In my language, I phrase that as a hearts and minds campaign that museums can wage. So to the panel, do you think that museums can wage this hearts and minds campaign in a way that might be a bit more effective than traditional policy routes? You can go in any order.
Can I start? I would say all of the above. We need all hands on deck, all strategies. So. Yeah, so I mean, I think, museums, I think, like you were alluding to at the beginning, have an incredible opportunity. They have a captive audience, a receptive audience, they are very trusted, and I think they should do more. I think they should do more on, critical thinking, and I actually led a study, an NSF-funded study on how to develop critical thinking in undergraduates in conservation classrooms. So this is a topic of high interest to me, but I think it can be done, by also museums, I think, being a little more bold about their values and their missions, and really putting this front and center in everything that they do. Because I think it's not enough, really, given the challenges we're facing, to just stop in, for example, describing the wonders of the deep ocean. You also have to talk about the challenges in the ocean. And so I think everything should be linked to the challenges that we face with of course, being careful to give people tools for action and engagement that doesn't leave them, in despair, because there are many challenges out there. So I think we have a huge opportunity. I think that we also have a challenge in the sense that some of the cultural exhibitions, for example, in our museums require rethinking and updating. And so that can be another way in which we can really make a difference, is in really bringing those up and, to match 21st century realities, and the people that are depicted, for example, the cultures that are depicted, et cetera. So that can create a new frame of mind. I think that will go a long way.
The challenges are too big and the time is too short.
That's too easy an answer.
No, I mean, it's not. In 2050, the weight of plastic in the ocean will equal the weight of fish if we don't do anything. Do you think that we can go there if we let people just say, if you are interested, or maybe you do this or you do that? I mean, we need to say what has to be done. I volunteered at the zoo here in DC over the summer for an exhibition about plastic in the oceans, where they created the sculptures based out of the debris that was sent. And I spoke with 300 people a day. Not one single person disagreed or said, and most of the people did not know how important it was. And if you would ask them if they were going to change their attitude, they really were happy to do so. There is a survey done by the Ocean Network, and every year they do the same, about how people think about the oceans, et cetera, et cetera. And what they find is that the people increasingly over the last 15 years are dissatisfied with the answers that they get in museums about what they should do to solve the problems. Yes. And so we have to be aware of that. Most of our members think about their boards first, how they are there. They should think about their visitors in the first place. And most of their visitors want to do stuff. And they want, and so.
So actually, that leads to our next question.
Okay, can I just say one last thing?
And then I want Walter.
I think it's more about really encouraging the visitors to question their mental models and the big assumptions that we're making in society, like that it is okay to continue to do this, as opposed to just saying, here are 5 things you can do. It's more about, you should be asking big questions.
Right. And I think what museums have been struggling with, you guys can hear me, right? Not really. Sorry. I think what museums have been struggling with is whether or not they should remain neutral, museums and science centers, because they don't want to appear to be championing one side or the other. We've gone through this false equivalency discussion. And so what do you think? Well, should museums remain neutral, or should we do, as Dave, as Walter is proposing, that we choose a side and stop playing safe?
Okay, well, a good part of my career has been spent in natural history museums as a researcher, curator, and it's a terrible thing to confess. I've never been involved in exhibit development, and most of the time I find museum exhibits horribly boring. And the worst thing I could say as a person at the Smithsonian is I really like the American Museum's exhibits much better than ours. And it's partly because the Smithsonian is a mostly government organization, and it's very risk averse, and museums are very risk averse for saying the wrong thing, that somebody's gonna, how many of you live in Washington? All right, so if you lived in Washington for any period of time, you know that the worst thing that can happen for you is to wind up on the wrong page of the Washington Post. Okay, front page of the style section, exhibit's great. Anywhere else in the paper, an exhibit does not want to be. And so they avoid anything that's controversial, preachy, advocative. I mean, the word is advocacy. Should museums have advocacy positions for particular actions? Now, we can advocate for better critical thinking skills, for a more informed public. That's safe territory. But plastics in the ocean is sure to offend somebody somewhere. So when I walk into a museum exhibit, I very quickly can say, oh, this is very politically correct, and I got to get out of here. It's just really boring, you know. It's a three-dimensional textbook. Three-dimensional textbooks are not any more interesting than two-dimensional textbooks. So I envy the organizations that can take these risks.
Can I just say thank you for that? But you know, I, as the person in charge of conservation at the museum, I am frustrated. I still feel like we're not taking enough risks. We've done exhibits on climate change, on water, on food, which were all controversial. And the Cuba exhibit was a risk as well. And yet, I feel we could do more. And I agree with you that so basically what I'm trying to say is I think we need to go for informed engagement,
Right.
but we also need to put our values very explicitly out there.
I want to say one thing, though. Museums, I'm not sure about science centers. Probably, yeah, science centers could do this, too. The Secretary of the Smithsonian has a strong position that the Smithsonian has convening power. We should be convening meetings where these things get discussed. And being host to a public debate over these things is not taking an advocacy position except for public discourse. So I think that there's no good excuse for a museum, whether it's a local museum or a national museum, not to have a role as a meeting place for discussion.
Right, exactly. So I was going to say, just serving as a platform for where the conversation could occur. It doesn't mean you're choosing one side or the other, but you're definitely showing that this is an issue. And if you come to the exhibit, and of course, you don't want to be pretending like things are the same always, but you are having a guiding, informed discussion about what's going on. As Anna said, we have a question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Herman Baumer. I'm with the National There's been
I didn't know there was
couple
such a thing.
references already by speakers to the need to promote critical thinking and trying to promote critical thinking. It's been my experience that natural history museums seem to generally present the theory of macroevolution as a given, and they don't present the scientific arguments pro and con. At least I know that's true with respect to the natural history museum in Washington. I'm not sure about the American
Well, Eldridge was at our museum,
Yeah.
so I think so. Niles Eldridge was the curator at our museum, so I assume so.
Yes.
But it seems to me you would help promote critical thinking if the museum, the Natural History Museum, did present scientific arguments pro and con with respect to the theory of macroevolution. Get the arguments out there and let the students evaluate it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Possibly.
I
Wait,
kn-
can I ask
I-
a question? David, would you come to that exhibit?
I know of no such body of evidence.
No.
Well, I think theories are often tested based on prediction. And one prediction can be made that if the theory of macroevolution were true, one would predict that in looking at various forms of life, one would expect to see features that are neither good nor bad, which is neutral features. That features arose through random chance processes, so some would be bad, some would be good, and some would be neutral. If you look out at the forms of life, you see very few organisms that have these neutral features.
Yeah. Thanks very much. This is. I don't think this is the.
No, I don't think
forum
this is
for
the form. And in terms of neutral features, we have tonsils, which aren't very useful for anything, but they get infected and you can remove them and still live. But thank you for the question. And I think we'll get back to the diplomacy issue because we wanted to focus mostly on science diplomacy.
Disappointing to see that there's no interest in a rational debate.
Oh, sure. No, I think we've all pined in our thoughts, and we can continue the debate, but we'd like to just, because we're short on time, get back to the main topic on science diplomacy for a minute, and then we can continue the discussion afterwards, if you would like to, for sure. So one question I'd like to, again, bring to the panel, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So this, how, you see right now we're in this climate of internationalism versus nationalism, and it kind of speaks to having all sides have a say at museums. How do you think museums should approach this? And inherently, museums are international entities, right? As we've demonstrated, either through exhibition or field work or activities that we're doing to educate the public. And so when it gets risen to the point that it is currently now in this atmosphere, where do we go?
Yeah, I want to make a particular point about the practice of diplomacy in science, in particular biodiversity, and the whole Nagoya Protocol and conservation issue falls into this trap. It's very easy to assume that, as I caricatured in my first slide, the North is greedy and the South is put upon. And the developing countries might erect barriers to collaborative research to protect their natural wealth. And that's in some cases true. But in fact, a lot of the resistance to international collaborations is because of domestic politics within countries. That is, if the ruling party is an internationalist party that wants to open doors to foreign investment, invite pharmaceutical companies in to do bioprospecting, joint product development, training, very collaborative, the opposition party, which might be nationalist, has a stick to beat them with. Our government is giving away our heritage. They're robbing the country and giving the money to the evil North. The opposite could be that a nationalist party is ruling and the opposition party is saying, why are they keeping you from getting jobs? Why aren't they going after international investment that can help raise our quality of life? So what looks to the casual observer like a North-South debate is actually a domestic political battle.
So the question is, what is the question exactly? Is it should museums be kind of focused on the national issues, or are they international institutions? Remind me again.
How do they handle the tension between the two when you have situations as Walter's just described?
Yeah.
When it's, sorry,
Sorry.
Dave.
No, I just raised the point to say scientists should be aware and not get sucked into a problem that's not of their making. That they're not, as a scientist at the Smithsonian, I can't solve their domestic political problem. I can still go about the business of building relationships with other scientists.
And you can make sure that they are based on trust, transparency, respect, et cetera, et cetera. That would be a real key, absolutely. Which sadly is still not always the case. So that is important. I think all to say that I think at the Museum of Natural History we have now over 5 million visitors a year, many of them international. And we do see our scope and the interest of our visitors as international in scope and global in scope. So, and we lead 100 expeditions a year. So it is certainly an international purview and scope, I would say.
I thought that your question was more about the recent events and the migrations and refugee issues.
As well,
and,
yes.
and that, right? So two things about that. In Europe in particular, a number of museums are taking this on really, as you saw from the guy from Greece that I showed, but he's not the only one, and some have been doing very straightforward things, which is refugees come in a history museum, and then they are hired as explainers to be explaining their own history to the visitors and including that in the program of the museum itself. So some are very proactive in that. But I would make it a little bit larger in the sense that we, as Science Center, we pretend that we are really relevant for our communities. And if you say that, that means something. And for me, it means that you should not be just there and say, it's very important that you come, and that everybody comes to our museum, but that you have to listen to what your community has to say. And today, the problems in the communities are really related to these questions of immigration and changing demographics and all of that around the museums itself. And we should take that more into account as part of our, because we're going to lose connection with where we are. And that's and absolutely not acceptable. So we really need, in 20 years ago, we were in the deficit model about science communication, right? When people said, you know, if you don't understand it, we're going to explain you more, and you should read more, and like that. And then you will finally understand. And we thought that not in terms of a dialogue and listen to the people with the questions that they are and things like that. We are now in the deficit model responding to our communities. We think just that we have to be advocating for ourselves more in our communities rather than listening more to our communities.
Can I make one more comment? Or so I think another important thing is, what are the interactions people have at the museum? So Paulo Freire, for example, the educator and philosopher, said, you know, the classroom is really a mini society, a model of society, right? So if every day students go there and get talked to, and there is an authoritarian figure, this is what they're going to recreate in society. And so museums can also be seen as a place where we can recreate society in new ways. And so we can give those messages by partnering with the communities that we work with to create our exhibits, by bringing in the humanities, by bringing in artists from the communities, by partnering with indigenous curators to develop, anthropological and cultural exhibitions. And so I think those are ways in which you can really change the narrative and the implicit ideas about how knowledge is created, how society works, et cetera, et cetera.
15 years ago, just a small anecdote. 15 years ago, I worked for the South African government for their policy on science communication. And we were driving in a van in Johannesburg, and we passed a big building, and the driver was an African black guy. And I asked him and said, "What is this?" He said, "There's a Natural History Museum." Yeah, wait. I said, "Oh, how do you like it?" He said, "I've never been."
Right.
And I say, "And why?" He said, "Well, under apartheid, we were not allowed to go. Right. Only the Thursdays between 5 and 6 in the afternoon. So, of course, we didn't go." And then when apartheid was done and the museum was open, people thought, "Oh, no, they're going to rush and see it." And we didn't. And I say, "Why?" "Because it was not made for us." Right. And so there is a very strong thing from the beginning when you're building the architecture that is, as the program, the way you paint it, that really has to reflect upon the community around you. If it doesn't, they are not going to come. Right. So.
And we have time for one more question from the audience. Yes, please. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a big question, though, but yeah.
Yes. I think there are many nuances. Do we do them justice every time, all the time? It's hard. We try, I think, but I recently heard a very interesting talk of a museum that I wish I could tell you, because I don't have all the data now in my head. But of a cultural exhibition about a place in the Pacific. So I'm sorry, I don't have the details with me. But what I'm saying is, it was co-curated by people from this place and people from the colonial, power, France in this case. And then the exhibition then traveled to the Pacific. So it was going to be seen in both places. It was co-curated by both places. You have a lot of richness there, and I think we have to continue to explore what those avenues are for creating those. In the Cuba exhibit, similarly, we worked with Cubans very closely, and we hope that in the future some of our exhibits may be able to go to Cuba, although they have no interest in our film on Cuban history.
So there are very big trends to answer your question. You said it earlier. In the developed world, the interest for science and scientific careers is really not the biggest, and it's really, most of the kids are not interested in scientific careers. When you go in developing countries, they are. And they are because they see science as a solution for their daily problems. They want to really use science they want to be veteran doctors or not nuclear physicists, but they want to be doctors and things like that because they see how that can help, right? So that's a big difference. In Europe, the way that they look at this, the relation between science and society is much more intense and much more involving the two parts. This public is much more involved in discussing science policies than it is in the US, for example. The Responsible Research Initiative in the European Union is, for example, something that where the public is involved in discussing what priorities, what ethical research is, together with the scientists, something that Americans are not so familiar with. If you go to South America, they are very socially engaged. They want science to be directly helping solutions that are in the city, and you know, all of that. So these are big, very big differences. You have much more girls in science in Thailand than you have in Canada, you know, all of the, yeah. So you have to take that into account all the time, yeah.
So we're getting close to the end because I think the plenary session is going to begin. But I would like to just, Dave, do you want to add something too? Okay. I just wanted to end with a sort of a quick summary of what we've been discussing. And initially, when you think museums and science centers, most people don't see how it links to science diplomacy. But I hope that what we've presented to you today certainly helps you to see that it's actually quite integral to what we do. And it's actually something that isn't brand new or a jargon to pin on to the Sustainable Development Goals, although I think it's really nice that the Sustainable Development Goals nicely reflect what's happening in museums, and in an educated, informed way, we can find links of advocating and informing in more, in a way that enables museums to move forward sort of more integrally with the communities that they serve. Thank you guys for coming, and see you outside.